O'Connor. Well, not since the protests of Tiananmen Square back in 1989 have so many people in China risked arrest and other repercussions by taking their anger and frustration to the streets. These rare demonstrations have openly criticised President Xi Jinping and his zero-COVID policy, and they've already had some effect. Some of China's biggest cities are now easing some pandemic restrictions. Since the protests began, the world has been going behind the headlines to talk to people about what is driving this fresh wave of protest. First, our reporter Sean Manteso examines the creative methods protesters are using to challenge the Chinese Communist Party.
In China, a blank piece of paper says more than words ever could. Anti-government dissent is rare here, and those participating face the prospect of arrest and even jail. As police begin to crack down, people are finding novel ways to have their voices heard. Protesters, angry about the country's strict COVID measures, are holding up empty sheets of paper to avoid arrest or run afoul of China's censorship laws. Elsewhere, they chanted for more PCR tests. An obvious joke, but a clever way to avoid explicit defiance. In Beijing, students got creative by raising signs showing an equation created by physicist Alexander Friedman, whose surname is pronounced similarly to free man. Online, where negative messages are scrubbed, netizens are posting walls of text using the Chinese characters for positive words like yes, good or correct, in a show of implicit dissent. While authorities have so far remained relatively restrained, acts of defiance in China, even novel ones, are still hugely risky.
It's highly dangerous. I think we haven't really seen the repressive apparatus fully engaged at this point, but unfortunately, I think that is what we're going to observe in the days and weeks to come.
Chinese state media, meanwhile, made no mention of the protests in last night's bulletin. And the Foreign Ministry says there will be no change to China's COVID policies.
We believe that with the leadership of the Communist Party of China and cooperation of the Chinese people, our fight against COVID-19 will be successful.
The country's leaders may still believe the current policy is the correct one, but increasingly it feels like many Chinese people do not. Sean Manteso, ABC News.
Bang Zhao is a bilingual reporter for ABC Chinese. He says the protests have evolved into something of a political awakening.
I think it's a very complicated situation in China at the moment. COVID-0 policy is surely at the core of protesters' messages sending to the whole world. But at the same time, when we look at the development of the Chinese society, the economy, even the politics in the last 10 years, we see a huge downturn, which people were worried about. And some protesters I spoke to in the past 48 hours give me a more clear message. Some of them, they believe that, they don't have hope. Many of them were university students, currently in their early 20s, but having spent about 3 years in lockdowns and constant COVID-0 strategies means that, they don't have traveling, they don't have, exchange opportunities, and they don't really see a hope for future job opportunities as well. They feel they have nothing to lose. But at the same time, there were people, they had this political awakening period in the last, 3 days when they realized that the message that the government is sending to the people is very different from what the world is looking like.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because it feels like it's really connected to the World Cup. Now, the first time these images have been uncensored for people living in China, and they suddenly going, hey, this is not the way the rest of the world is living. Why are we living like this?
Yeah, soccer is actually one of the most popular sports games in China. And at the same time, it's actually the President Xi Jinping's favorite sport game ever. So when, a lot of Chinese people are so passionate about this, when they were watching the live streaming of the, World Cup games, they realized that in a stadium where about, tens of thousands of audiences were there without having a mask, That is a big question for a lot of people, even when they are living in a confined apartment for 3 months. At the same time, they may question all of the narratives spread by the propaganda machine and by the state-owned media in the past, if that was the true message.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And when you talk of this political awakening, what is surprising are these calls for President Xi to resign. Now, you wouldn't have dreamt that that would have happened even if there was dissatisfaction with the COVID-0 policy.
I think it is very unlikely something would happen in the next, a couple of weeks for now, as we say. A lot of people in China, even though we've seen probably thousands of people were on the streets shouting against the government, but the real message about the President Xi and the Communist Party is not a strong voice. The majority of people were still calling on the government to stop and end its COVID-0 strategy. Many of them were calling on opening up the economic development. Some of them were asking about, to investigate the deaths of the fire victims in Urumqi. So there are a lot of things going on, but the actual message against President Xi Jinping and the government is not the strongest voice so far.
That's interesting.
But what is unprecedented, on the other hand, is that we never heard about it in the previous protests in China. Probably a month ago, when one person was arrested by the police in a very busy overpass in Beijing, we've seen people calling on the President Xi and called him as a dictator. But now we've seen a lot of people who are actually echoing his message, which is very interesting.
Which is unusual. So we've seen arrests. We know that there can be brutal crackdowns if Xi decides that to be the case. How concerned are you, and how concerned are people you're talking to, that there will be a very brutal crackdown?
In terms of brutality, it is quite complicated to define on which extent or degree it could be, some means that protesters wouldn't be able to accept. From the visuals we received exclusively from our sources in Shanghai and Beijing, we found there was a small scale of conflict between the police force and the protesters on the street. People were taken by the police forcibly, and lots of protesters at the scene were shouting against the police and asking them to stop doing that. But in terms of a more brutal crackdown, we haven't seen it yet. It also depends on how fast and how big how the scale is developing in China in the next couple of days.
Yes, we have to watch that.
We've seen the government actually took a little bit, measures to meet the protesters' demands in terms of relaxing a bit of the COVID-0 strategy in some certain cities. But in terms of an official response to the protesters' demandings, it is very still unlikely to happen.
Right, interesting. What is the symbolism of the white pieces of paper that some people are holding up?
So when it comes to the white piece of paper, we have to talk about what triggered this whole protest in China. Basically, the fire that took reportedly about 10 people's life in Urumqi in China's western region of Xinjiang triggered people's public mourning about, how the COVID measures impacted people's life, because reportedly those people died in the fire incidents were locked up in their apartments. The door of their room was sealed, and the entrance of the apartment building was locked. And even for the fire truck, cannot really reach the building. It has to, do the operation about 100 meters away from the building. So people started to question, is this the public health measures to protect people's health and life, or it is the measure that kills people? And a white piece of paper is really a symbol for a funeral setting, for public mourning in Chinese culture. And at the same time, because of the censorship, whatever people posted on social media about the mourning and the fire incidents was censored by social media platforms and the government. So because of that sentiment is too strong, people started to express it in a more passive, aggressive way without writing anything on the paper, but showing a really strong message to the government.
Yeah, very interesting. Bang, so good to hear what people are telling you and your perspective. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Beth.
Baidio Tao is a Chinese-born political artist who lives and works in Australia. Speaking to us from Brussels, he applauded the protesters for standing up to Xi Jinping's stringent policies and also the creativity they've used in their defiance of the government.
I think it's really marvelous to seeing this current situation that in China, that so many protests has happened, well, national-wide. And a lot of method that they're using art, a form of almost like art performance, is quite stunning. One of that is particularly the use of the blank sheet of paper. So now we actually have a name of the whole environment, campaign, which we call the A4 revolution. A4 is referring to this blank sheet of paper. So in China, it's highly risky to protest for whatever reason, and anything that you put on your sign in the protest can be used for the persecution lately. So the young generation here is just using a white sheet of paper without writing anything, but simply using the gesture to holding the paper in the sky. Even though there's no specific message on those paper, but just the action, the courage that bring them to the streets is strong enough to saying they're demanding more than just being treated under this very brutal zero COVID lockdown.
Yeah. What have you learned from people in China that you've been speaking to about how they view these protests and what they're trying to accomplish?
Well, I think it's really because all these 3 years of very harsh zero COVID policy, that pushing the limitation of how much the Chinese people can really take, especially for the younger generation. There are a lot of moving videos that appearing from the front line of the protest. A lot of young generation are saying they cannot see their future. They don't feel they have a future in this country if this kind of government, if this kind of a policy continues. So really what they want is a change in the entire environment. It might be, very specific demanding, which is ending the current COVID control. But for more, they are actually asking for more. For some protests, like in Shanghai and other cities, we even hearing the impossible chanting like China's Communist Party stepping down, Xi Jinping stepping down. So this is not just a protest against certain policy. This is something more fundamental. This is asking for universal human rights there.
Yeah, and some have almost described it as a political awakening for many people. But you talk about the difficulty of protests and how hard it is to do that in China, to be public about your opposition. Another prominent artist, Ai Weiwei, has said this is not going to go anywhere. The police are going to crush this movement. Do you agree?
Well, this is what Chinese government always trying to do. Usually we have this three-step method. So firstly, they would forbidden people to exchange opinion freely. We've seen police in the city like Shanghai are checking personal device like phones on the street just to see if they have VPN or the apps they don't supposed to have, which will be just Twitter or Telegram or WhatsApp. Then the second step that they will do is smear the campaign, polluting the message and saying this is not a spontaneous reaction from the Chinese people, but being manipulated by so-called foreign force. And the third thing is when they control the narrative and completely insert their propaganda, they will launch the cracking down, possibly violent cracking down. But because of that, by the time they've already have the narrative and sort of legitimize the possible cracking down.
Yeah. You've already created some works for these protests. Tell us about them.
Well, I've been following the development from the very beginning, since the Urumqi protest. So I did a work that is, dedicating to the Urumqi protest, but also Shanghai's protests that are echoing with the demonstration there and memorizing some of the victims died because of fire, and this fire cannot be put out due to the very absurd methodology of COVID control. The fire engines couldn't enter the community. And also, I'm working on projects like dedicating to this blank paper protest, and a lot of art is creating around that scene as well.
Yeah, that would be great to see. Now, ironically, you are in Brussels. You're going to be opening this exhibition that also deals with the COVID-0 policy. What are you trying to say with this exhibition? What is the message you're wanting to get to the world?
Well, before we starting this exhibition, I never expect that the situation in China will grow so rapidly. But obviously, the zero COVID policy and the problem of it is always seen for the China's human rights issues for a long time. So that's why the poster and the entire scene of the show has a lot to do with pointing out China's misconducting and terrible policy, with this zero COVID thing. But also, I think it's a very good opportunity that I can bring those art, bring those stories from the streets in China to the politicians, to the big communities of European Union, that letting them know what is going on and also asking their help and asking their support to the people back in China.
Yeah. Do you get the sense that more we saw, Rishi Sunak saying, that their policies are going to change? There is pushback from a number of other countries. Do you think people are other countries realise that they can't just follow China just because of its economy and what that brings to countries?
Well, that's exactly right. I think it's very important. More and more countries should realize it is very toxic to depending on an economy with no rule of law, with no respect to democracy and the people's will. In the longer term, it will only harming and hunting all of us outside of China. For the European country, yes, and also for Australia, definitely.
Yeah, really good to chat to you, and good luck with the exhibition.
Thank you very much.
The protests have, though, led to police deploying a heavy presence in several Chinese cities, including its financial capital, Shanghai. China Director of the Economist Corporate Network, Matty Bekink, says the government is running the risk of losing control of not just the virus, but of public patience as well.
Shanghai, it depends a little bit on who you're talking to. On the one hand, I think it's important, dramatic and consequential as the images coming out of China have been, to remember that we're talking about hundreds of people in a city of tens of millions. And given the very quick actions by Chinese government censors, there are many people in Shanghai who have no idea that anything happened over the weekend. And then there are others for whom this is kind of a full-time occupation at the moment, watching what's happening on social media, seeing what's happening in particular on social media outside China's firewall. But the mood is certainly, particularly on Urumqi Lu or Urumqi Street, which is where the vigil began that turned into a protest. It's been barricaded off. It's a very hip kind of shopping district with also residential compounds, kind of a very trendy location, but the shops are difficult to access. Kind of the hipster cafes are probably not doing the brisk business they usually would be, and there is a heavier police presence. So when people do go by there, they're asked to not take photographs or asked to delete photographs. People, I believe, have also had phones kind of confiscated while the police delete photographs. So, the incident has clearly, in some sense, come to a conclusion in Shanghai.
Yeah. The issue hasn't gone away in terms of the government staying committed, they say, to this form of COVID-0. They say there's been a bit of tinkering at the edges, but you'd imagine that the desire to end these restrictions is going to stay.
Yes, I think the risk for Beijing now is losing both control of the virus and public patience. And that's a little bit what we're seeing at the moment. On November 11th, there was an announcement of 20 measures that were meant to kind of loosen some of the restrictions, but we've seen most of those measures not being implemented at the local level amid surging cases. Now, we are now at kind of the highest level of cases we've ever seen in China since the outset of the pandemic, certainly higher than during the strict lockdowns that we experienced in Shanghai. And although Shanghai is mostly not locked down, other cities across China are. And since the beginning of this week, we've also seen the highest number of cities in China with restrictions that we've seen since April. So in terms of both cases and public sentiment, things are going in the wrong direction. And I think your question or your comment, about kind of zero COVID and the continuation of it, it feels endless, relentless, kind of this perpetual policy. And I think that's what a little bit of these this kind of outpouring of discontent was related to. People are COVID zero weary and frustrated.
Not only from a personal freedom point of view, but also the economic impact this is having on people's lives. And it's been dragging on for a long time. How is it flowing through as this continues?
It's an excellent point. I always like to say that it's important to remember that this is not just, a couple of spoiled expatriates in Shanghai complaining because it's difficult to fly in and out of the country. This is people's livelihoods across the country, because at this point, as the virus has spread throughout China, it's really disrupted many people's livelihoods, their educations, their mental, emotional, physical health, as even getting care for non-COVID related or illnesses or COVID restrictions make it difficult sometimes to receive primary care. Youth unemployment is at a very high level right now. So we've seen, for example, over the past few days, over 70 universities have had some form of kind of protest or action to express discontent with the policies. And that's also because a lot of these, highly educated young people are facing kind of grim economic prospects. The controls have really stomped on both consumer and investor confidence, and we've seen the drag on China's growth, and the economic outlook remains quite bleak. And so I think it's both economic and personal frustration that people are experiencing at the moment.
And, Maddie, it's not just China, because China is such a powerhouse economy that fuels so much of the global economy. It's really flowing on to many other countries that are already struggling.
That's exactly right. China has been the largest and most reliable source of global growth for a long time. In the last 20 years, it's accounted for 25% of GDP growth globally. And we're seeing it really drag on regional growth and global growth. I mean, it was China who actually carried the world kind of out of the financial crisis recession in 2008, 2009, and China who began the recovery out of the initial wave of the pandemic. So it feels all the more disconcerting now to see China heading into our fourth winter of COVID, while the rest of the world seems to kind of started the experience with the pandemic later and ended it earlier. Even though, of course, COVID is not over anywhere, the populations have shifted from needing to manage living with the virus through lockdowns and instead through vaccinations and medications should they become ill.
Yeah. Another big powerhouse is Huawei, that had been making inroads globally, but they are coming under increasing pressure too. The US has banned telecommunications equipment. Europe too is really questioning whether a relationship with Huawei is a good way to go. What impact is this going to have on the company's future?
Huawei's in a difficult place, not unlike kind of China when it comes to zero COVID. It's between a rock and a hard place right now. The US has made very clear that it is trying to, constrain China's kind of rise and access and development of significant tech with national security capabilities, particularly the most recent CHIPS Act. You've seen that. Huawei, I believe, has become emblematic of this tech rivalry. And of course, the US is putting pressure on allies to follow suit in relation to Huawei and its 5G capabilities in particular, and most are going along with it so far. I think, Huawei is exactly where no company wants to be in relation to US-China rivalry, which is squarely in the middle. And so I think Huawei has sought to kind of diversify some of its economic activities and business activities to make up for the fact that it's not going to get market access in markets that it was counting on. But if the goal was to kind of kneecap Huawei and its development, so to speak, that's certainly been something that we're seeing.
Yeah, that is interesting. And of course, I guess with the Ukraine war, it's become very apparent that no country can be too dependent on any one other country and also any one company.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. At The Economist, we used to say decoupling could be seen everywhere except in the trade and investment data. I believe that's changing this year. You really started to see, for a whole host of reasons, but the Ukraine war was probably the icing on the cake, so to speak, or it's a very miserable cake if you think about the end of globalization. But that, the new concepts of this new geography of global business, disruptions, geopolitical pressures, where having all of, your eggs in one basket, be it China or anyone else, seems too risky. Obviously, Europe is learning this lesson the hard way when it comes to energy and Russia, but you see increasingly here regionally in Asia, a question of whether a China +1 strategy or even, a nearshoring, friendshoring, there are all of these terms that were developed pre-pandemic, pre-war, but you're now seeing kind of investments being more strategically made in trying to manage risk and diversify risk.
Great to speak, as always, Maddie. Stay safe there and we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.